Welcome. Thank you for joining us for First Person Conversations with Holocaust Survivors. I'm Bill Benson, and I have hosted First Person for 25 years. Each month, we bring you firsthand accounts of survival during the Holocaust. Each of our First Person guests serves as a volunteer at the museum. Please send us your questions and let us know where you are watching from in the live chat. We are honored to have Holocaust survivor Manny Mandel share his firsthand account of survival with us. Manny, thank you for joining us and for agreeing to be our first person.
You're welcome. I'm glad to be here.
Manny, we have a great deal to cover, so we'll go ahead and get started. Manny, you were born in Riga, Latvia in 1936. Before we turn to World War II and the Holocaust, please tell us about your parents, and let's start with your mother, Ella.
My mother was a young woman who grew up in Yugoslavia or Hungary, whichever time of the war you're talking about. She was one of 6 children, 3 women and 3 men. She had a very pleasant middle-class life in those days, became an elementary school teacher. I think they used to go to normal school graduate. And she was teaching in a community not far from Novisad. I think she commuted there every day probably by some trolley or some train, not far where she taught little kids.
And tell us about this photo, if you don't mind.
I'm not quite certain exactly where this is. It could be in Riga still, where I was born. But my father was ready to leave Riga to his dream job in Hungary. And this may have been done before he left. It depends on how old I am. I don't really know, but I think I was 4, 6, maybe 8 weeks old when I left Riga. So this could have been in Riga before we left or in Budapest after we arrived there. But no matter how you slice it, I'm a baby.
And of course, here's your father, Yehuda, who was born into an observant Orthodox Jewish family. Please tell us about your father.
My father was born in Transylvania, the land that you only know because one Dracula came from there. My father told me he never met him, which I can understand. My father was one of 7 children to a person who had a bit of a farm, and he became a county clerk. He was not a successful businessman, but he did raise 7 children, one of whom he sent to the United States in 1914. He lived in the village for the first number of years, eventually studied in Vienna, and had major positions as a cantor in major synagogues throughout Europe.
Manny, for those in our audience who may be unfamiliar, can you briefly describe what a cantor is?
The cantor in the Jewish community is the leader of the service, not to in any way demean rabbis who are in charge of the synagogue and its machinations. The cantor is one who leads the service. And in Europe in the middle 1900s, it was a much bigger job than it is today. Many synagogues today have no cantor. But in those cantors were there, and choirs, and synagogues were large production numbers.
Manny, your parents moved to Latvia, where, as we mentioned, you were born in 1936. Your stay was a short one, however, before you all moved to Budapest, Hungary. Tell us why your family moved to Budapest and what life was like at that time. My
father went to a well-known Kantorenschule, a Cantor's Institute in Vienna for several years in the late 20s. This was a school that was connected with the Vienna Conservatory. When he graduated, his dream in life, being an ethnic Hungarian, was to be in Budapest. But he couldn't get working papers because, first of all, he was a Jew. And secondly, there were issues his having served in the Czech army. So he couldn't get papers. He looked around at a number of places and did what they used to call auditions in London, in Hook of Holland, in Groningen, and eventually was able to secure a job because they wanted him to come to Riga to succeed a well-known cantor who had died some years before. But his dream was to Budapest. So we were in Hungary we were in Latvia for about 3 years. We have no connections there. My wife and I went there some years ago for a weekend just to see the place. But they had no connections. They were happy to move to Budapest in 1936 when he did receive papers that permitted him to get a job in Budapest.
And Manny, you described his taking the position in Budapest as a really big deal.
What it was, this was the second largest synagogue in Budapest, a synagogue with a 40-person choir.
Mm-hmm.
You can imagine. And it was a very prestigious position. My father always said he had a ministerial salary. I don't know exactly what that means, but obviously it was an upper middle class living that we had.
Manny, go ahead. I'm sorry.
It wouldn't matter to a kid, as you see the kid over here, but that's what he told me it was.
And say a little bit about this photo of you and a friend.
Well, our apartment was not far walking distance easily to the Danube River in the 7th district of Budapest. And my mother, I remember this kind of, I must be 4 or so, before 5. I don't remember who the kid is. I have a vague recollection it could have been a kid from around the corner that I was friends with, but I don't know. And I decided to just shovel the ice free, and it took me a while.
And we have another photo of you with your father here.
It's the same time, but I think a little later, maybe a year later, my father and I are coming home from the marketplace where we used to go occasionally buy certain things. I loved when he bought peas, shelled peas, because I ate most of them on the way home, things like that. How there was a camera in person in that place, I don't know, but I remember where this was, and my father and I are here. He's in his 30s, and I'm probably 5.
Manny, World War II began in September 1939 when Germany invaded Poland. In 1940, Hungary allied itself with Nazi Germany, and then in 1941, joined the German-led invasions of both Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union. Please tell us what you remember about those early years of the war.
Well, I need to point out that Hungary was an ally of Germany in the First World War. As a matter of fact, the leader of Hungary, whose king had abdicated, the king was a regent, not a king. The leader was a regent by the name of Horthy. Horthy was an admiral in the Navy, which is kind of peculiar because how in heaven's name can you be an admiral in a landlocked country? But he earned his legitimate admiralty stripes in the war, First World War in the Adriatic Sea between Yugoslavia and Italy on the side of the German government. So Hungary was an early town from the end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And there was a great deal of German culture and German language in Hungary. The war, however, when it started in Poland and later on, did not affect Hungary in any significant way until a little bit later, although men who were part of the Hungarian army, in fact, were part of the Russian invasion, which, as you know, lost Hitler the war.
And I think the impact on you in the early stages of the war were mostly, I guess you would have to go into bomb shelters because of Allied bombing from time to time.
Budapest was a city that was not severely bombed. It was bombed because any bomb, even two, can be very damaging and very frightening. But Budapest was not bombed like some of the other European cities. It had no significance, no strategic significance, so they didn't bomb it. However, we lived on the 5th floor, the top floor of an apartment building, and when it's an air raid siren, you don't use the elevator. So we have to march down to the shelter and then march back up, sometimes twice a night. I would think on occasion, but infrequently, 3 times a night, which was, in one sense, adventuresome, but very frightening, because if a bomb fell in the building next door to you, it could have killed your friend, whoever, with whom you may have gone to school. So the notion of what the bomb did as an unknown was very frightening. The incident itself of being involved was kind of exciting for a little kid.
Yeah. Manny, although, as you noted, your experience in the early years was related more to the war itself, the Hungarian regime was anti-Semitic and actively discriminated against Jews. For example, your family employed a maid who suddenly was no longer allowed to work for your family. Will you tell us a little about that?
Sure. You want to know that the European cities, Budapest, which is a very modern city, was perhaps 10 or 15 years behind the US in terms of amenities. Most middle-class families had a live-in maid who helped my mother with laundry, which was all hand-done and cooked, with ice boxes, which we had instead of refrigerators. We had a gas range, hot water we had, but we had none of the other amenities of washing machines, drying machines, toasters, that kind of stuff. So the maid, who was a young woman, maybe 16 or so, from one of the local villages, not far from Budapest, was tremendously helpful and became part of the family. She had her own room and bath in our apartment, a different entrance, and she in many ways was the closest thing to my age, even though I was only 6. But she was my buddy of sorts.
And then she suddenly was no longer able to work for you.
She was told that she must leave. She wanted to take me with her to the farm. She thought I would be safer there. My parents would not permit it. I have no idea what became of her.
Manny, before we go on, I'd like you to know that we have people watching and listening to you today from all over, from many states. For example, today we have people from Massachusetts, Minnesota, Texas, Washington, and other states. But we also have people today from around the world. We have viewers from the United Kingdom, Israel, Malta, and Sweden. So thank you all for joining us today.
Let's say thank you to all of those who are watching. I'm glad to have you.
Manny, in the winter of 1941 into 1942, your family went to visit relatives in your mother's home city of Novisad, which was under Hungarian rule at the time, although today it's in Serbia. While you were there, you had a horrifying experience. Can you tell us about that incident?
Hungarian anti-Semitic laws were promulgated in the 1920s, but were not put into effect until well into the 1930s. But they did exist on the books, and they were part of the ruling class in various communities. Now, as I said, my mother came from Novisad. You mentioned before there was Yugoslavia and then Hungary. It has 3 names, which is not unusual for any number of Hungarian cities or cities in that part. Novisad is its Serbo-Croatian name. Újvidék is its Hungarian name, and Neustadt is its German name. And depending what the ruling party was, that's how the name was called. 2 aunts, a cousin, some uncles, and my grandparents, my mother's parents, lived in Novisad for most of their lives. And my parents decided to take a week's vacation in Novisad in December of 41. I was not yet in school. My father had the time, and we took a train because still travel by train. Passports were required, but they were available. We went down there and stayed in my mother's youngest sister's apartment, I think on a Friday, which was the 2nd or 3rd day that we were there. Knock, knock. Well, somebody came up this door, came up the stairs or the elevator, I don't remember, and said there's something funky going on in the street. Within minutes of that, 2 police officers came to the door and said rather nicely, it's interesting, I remember this being nicely, my father thought they were gruff. In any case, they said, ladies and gentlemen, this is December. It's not brutally cold outside, but it is winter. So please get dressed warmly, coats, scarves, hats, whatnot. You need to come outside for a census, which seemed almost routine because the Nazis conducted censuses, if that's the plural, every 15 minutes. That's an exaggeration, but with great frequency. They believe with justification that if they do the census with tremendous frequency and without announcement, they would know where everybody is. And they were right. In any case, we come down to the street. We're told to walk out on the sidewalk and turn left and start walking. We're not under any kind of duress, but we walked for a very long time. I walked, and I'm 5.5 years old. I walked, my father carried me, my mother carried me, until we arrived after several hours at a place which, believe it or not, I recognize. I'll tell you in a minute why. The scene was a 7-foot stockade fence on our left, the sidewalk, and a major boulevard avenue kind of road on our right. I recognize the place because in Europe, in communities that do not have a sea or lake, rivers become beaches. The Danube River flows through Novisad. That summer, perhaps in August or so, I was there on a previous trip, and I'm sure I played in the sand and went to a restaurant and went on the various rides and all the other kind of conveyances that the beach presented to the public. So I remember it. But this is winter. Danube is frozen 3 feet thick in the ice, and I had no idea why in heaven's name we were here. As we're walking, we notice that the gates to the 7-foot stockade fence are open. This is the gate which was the entrance to the beach and also the entrance to trucks and supplies and so forth. As we're walking down, we see that people are making a left turn and walking towards the river, which is probably 300 or 400 yards away from where we were. As we are doing this, there's a police officer on our right who says to my father, "Mister, what are you doing here?" My father, kind of bewildered, says, "I'm here with my family." He said, "No, that's not the point. The point is I know you're not from here. And if we count you in a census, you'll mess up the numbers." He believed this was a census. He said, my father said, "How do you know?" He says, "Well, I'm a foot patrolman in your neighborhood on the streets where you live. I've seen you on the streets many, many times, walking here, walking there, doing this, doing that. And I recognize you. You obviously would not recognize me. But since you're not from here and you're going to mess up the numbers, step aside." He didn't know that it saved our lives. Well, maybe not, but he could have. Because had we marched further and turned left, disaster would have happened, which I'll tell you about in a moment. However, within seconds of this event, a staff car came down this major highway. A soldier in uniform, an officer, stepped out and made an announcement with a bullhorn that says, "Ladies and gentlemen, the requirements of the census have been met. Go home. There's a school down the block. There's hot coffee and chocolate. You're welcome to have it." We didn't have the hot chocolate and the coffee. We grabbed the first taxi we could and went back to my aunt's apartment. At which point the phone began to ring off the hook. First was my mother's sister, the middle sister, who lived in a different part of the city, who said she too had 2 police officers came to the house. They came, they asked her some questions about some census. She answered them, she gave them a cup of coffee, and they went bye-bye. She never came to the river. Other people began to tell us what happened. As people walked down to the gate of this event and marched to the river, they found that the river had been cracked open that morning by cannon fire to break the ice. They were shot in the back, and they floated down the river to be found when the river thawed out in March, or found where the ice had been thinner, and they were found obviously dead. What I've just described to you, not having participated in, but having been witness to, in a sense, of a pogrom, a senseless, purposeless, reasonless event that people can do to you and you can do nothing about them. I experienced this in my year 5.5. I had no understanding of what the devil went on, but I can record it clearly.
We actually have a clip of your father reflecting on this harrowing experience from his perspective. Manny, let's go ahead and let's listen to your father's words.
People were crying, and when we heard ta-ta-ta-ta-ta, another few shots, we knew what's happening. We imagined what's happening, and people were crying and hollering and throwing themselves to the floor, to the ground, and as can well be imagined what happened. But before we should have gone in and be the next ones to be killed, the killing stopped. From there, we were taken into a gymnasium, walked back, and when we spoke about where we are going and what happened, one of the policemen who was walking alongside with us told me, "You are very lucky people."
This is such a powerful reflection from your father and what you described, Manny, and what you've described, as you said, is a pogrom, a violent attack against Jews. And supposedly it happened because it was a response to partisan activity or resistance fighters who supposedly were in the area. But as you said, you were basically next in line. Manny, the Hungarian government established a forced labor service, and your father was required to report to work in 1942. Tell us about the work that your father was forced to do and what that meant for you and your family.
As previously mentioned, the Hungarian military, all men, were in Russia fighting the Russians, trying to invade Russia. So the Hungarian government needed manpower, physical manpower, to do some of the work that the men couldn't do. Some mining, some railroad work, some agricultural work, and other kinds of things. So they organized kind of military-style battalions of people in Budapest and other places, all Jews, and marched them into these labor battalions. My father would get a phone call when we still had a phone, or somebody would come to the door, or get something in the mail that said on 3 o'clock on Tuesday, you will be in such and such a station, and you'll be gone for a day, a week, undetermined period of time to be in this labor camp. The picture that you see, these men, it looks to me like, first of all, if you notice, they have garrison caps on, which is kind of a military symbol. They're also repairing some kind of railroad. It looks to me like a mining railroad from the gauge, not a freight or passenger railroad. Who they are or what they're doing or where they are, I have no idea. But my father could have been in a similar situation where he was, which was very much in Hungary, maybe an hour away from Budapest, in a community called Vác.
And as you said, Manny, he might be told he's leaving for a day, a week, an indeterminate amount of time. But the upshot was over the next couple of years, you saw him very infrequently because of these forced labor that he was sent to do.
But also home, he was home for a day, a week, or undetermined period of time until he was again called back. As the labor became necessary, he was called back. One of the things interesting to me is that these people were invariably white-collar people whose knowledge of a shovel was nil. But well, you learn when you have to. And my father never had held a shovel in his life. Nothing wrong with that, except that was not his work. But he learned how to hold a shovel and a pick and an axe, and that's what he did.
Manny, during this time that you've described, you continued to go to a Jewish day school. When you were 7, German forces occupied Hungary on March 19th, 1944. Persecution of Jews then increased drastically. Soon, all Jews over the age of 6 were forced to wear a yellow Star of David badge on their clothing. How did wearing this star, how did that impact you?
Well, they came when I was already 8, which is not important except I had been in school for more than a year. The yellow star were required, and I thought that was great. I thought it was a major sign of distinction. Here I am, an 8-year-old or a 7-year-old, being able to wear a star outside on my coat, just like the adults did, made me a little adult, which for a 7-year-old is important. But what I didn't know is that every day when I went to school, which happened to have been by coincidence, like 3 blocks, 4 blocks from my house, you could see the school from my parents' bedroom window on the 5th floor on a corner. Somebody would follow me to school every day, my father or somebody. They arranged this kind of an escort service, which we didn't know about. Why? Because the star became a target. It was not an issue of being a sign of distinction. It became a target. Now, it didn't happen to me, but to some kids it did. They would knock them down and leave them in a gutter. They didn't have to kill them. They didn't take their backpack or their hat or their gloves or their shoes. They just were going to whack them on the head, and they did. And to avoid that, or to try to avoid it, somebody would follow me to school. Interestingly, I have absolutely no recollection, nor have I heard anything about being followed back from school in the afternoon, but I just don't remember that.
Manny, you, while your father was home between one of his forced labor periods, you asked him for a bicycle, which he did not get you. Tell us why.
He was home at home. And I asked him, I had a tricycle, but I'd outgrown the trike. I was already about 8 or something like that. And I said, I can't handle a 26-inch, but I can handle an 18-inch bike. He said, well, I would be delighted to buy a bike or 4 bikes. Economically, that was not an issue. But there are 2 reasons why I wouldn't do it. One is minor, and I'm willing to forgo that. We're on a 5th floor, and the elevator, which is 50 years old, often did not operate. Now, that means I would have to lug the bike down or lug the bike up 5 floors of stairs, which I'm willing to do. I could not do that. I was just not big enough for that. But there's another reason, which is the prohibiting reason. You ride a bicycle in the park. You walk the bike to the park and you ride in the park. If you're out of my sight for 15 seconds, the same thing that could have happened to you on the way to school could happen to you on the bike. They don't want your bike or your shoes or your hat or your gloves. They just want to whack you on the head. And for that reason, because of that precaution, we will not get you a bike. Let me add that we came to this country in 1949. I was 13 years old. And one of the very first purchases my parents made, not the first one, was one day I came back from school and they said, we're going shopping today to a department store. Things that don't exist today anymore. And on whatever 3rd floor they sold bikes. And I bought a beautiful Schwinn bike, which I had for several years.
Mm-hmm. Manny, before we go on, I'd like to remind our audience to please ask any questions they have of you. Use the chat feature so that we can get those questions on your behalf to Manny. In mid-May 1944, the Hungarian authorities began to systematically deport the Jews from the countryside. In less than 2 months, nearly 440,000 Jews were deported, mainly to Auschwitz-Birkenau killing center. Please tell us what happened to your grandparents and other family members.
And you have to back up just a little bit. In 1941, Hermann Goering, he's number 2 in the German government hierarchy, writes a letter on behalf of, or in the name of Hitler, talking about a final solution to the Jewish problem. But nothing is done with it. In 1942, a conference is called in Berlin called the Wannsee Conference. It's called Wannsee because it took place in the Wannsee Villa, which still exists. It's now a museum. The building has no significance. It was called by the head of the German government in Prague, a general who later was assassinated by the underground. The important part of this particular discussion is that the man is appointed to do the mechanics of the annihilation of the Jewish community. Who's that? Adolf Eichmann, who ran the trains, who cleaned out Belgium and Holland and France and every place else. But Hungary, being an ally of the Germans, was the last to receive this blessing. He arrives in Budapest on the 19th of March, 1944, very, very close towards the end of the war. He arrives and he had already been in the hinterlands of the country, but that's when it comes to Budapest, at which point 14,000 people a day are transported to the various camps, particularly Auschwitz. My grandparents, both my father's mother, I never knew my father's father, he died before I was born, and my mother's parents, mother and father, were deported in the same period of time. We know precisely my mother's parents' deportation timing was because my 2 aunts, one of whom I stayed with when we were in Novisad, the 2 aunts, one of my cousins, and the grandparents were deported in the same transport. When you arrived in Auschwitz, there was a process called the selection. One line went this way, there's the old people who were useless and the young people, kids, and they were probably killed within 48 hours. The other line were people who seemed like able to work, like my 2 aunts who were women in their 30s, and they lived. Those 2 aunts survived the war, and they knew precisely when they were deported, when they got to Auschwitz, and when they last saw their parents. So we know. I don't recall the date offhand, but sometime in the summer of 1944. That's what happened to them. The other thing that happened to us is that within hours or days of Eichmann's arrival, two gentlemen from a kind of a self-appointed rescue committee. One of whom was a Hungarian Jewish lawyer, the other was an engineer. They started to go see Eichmann. I must tell you that to see Eichmann in those days was equivalent to going to Rome and saying, I want to see the Pope now. Not easy. But they talked their way in. How? I don't know. And they decided to discuss some proposals for the saving of some Jews. Now, at this point, Eichmann had some interest in the proposals because everybody in the German government, with the exception of Hitler, knew that Germany was going to lose the war. And these high-level officials, and Eichmann was not at high level, but Himmler and others knew that they would have to have some provisions for themselves when the war comes to an end. Heinrich Himmler cannot go to a grocery store and say, I'd like to be a clerk. My name is Heinrich Himmler. I used to be number 3 in the German government. So they were looking for some ways of making any arrangements for their covering their rear ends. The proposal they came up with is this. The two men from the rescue committee said to Eichmann, release 1 million Jews from the concentration camps. We will provide you with 10,000 trucks laden with military materiel for the war. There was a major problem with this proposal. If Eichmann wanted to release 1 million people, and I don't think he did, but even if he did, he didn't have 1 million anymore. Most of them had been killed this late in the war. As far as 10,000 trucks, for those of you who know, would know that they didn't have a hubcap. Nothing. It was a total, absolute, incredible bluff. One of the two men under SS guard was actually shipped to Egypt, which is where the headquarters of the British Army that handled all of the vehicular stuff in Europe during the war was located, to see if you can get trucks from them. They jailed him as a spy. He was there until the end of the war, which is within a year, and then lived several years beyond that in Palestine and later in Israel.
And the one who remained doing the negotiations, Rudolf Kastner, ended up, through all these negotiations that went on for quite a while, ended up resulting in a train that was going to carry a number of Jews out of Europe. And somehow or another, you and your mother and your uncle David were part of this group. Tell us, do you know how you ended up being part of the group that was to be rescued?
The 1,010,000 trucks became 1,700 people and a 35-car freight train in July. How we became part of that group, I don't know, because nobody really does, except for the fact that my father had a responsible position in Budapest, was well known because of his job. My uncle was involved in the underground and the Zionist organizations of youth. And I guess through those connections, the three of us, and actually there was a fourth person at one point, became part of our group that were taken to go to, by train, to a neutral port. Spain, Turkey, Portugal, to be shipped out of Europe. Hitler wanted Jews out of Germany, he got that. Hitler wanted Jews out of Europe, he didn't quite get that. He wanted the Jews out of the world, he didn't get that really. But the point is that the neutral port would have been placed on some ships and shipped. I don't know to this day whether they would have been Palestine, likely, or Madagascar, which was one of the discussions for the transportation of Jews during those years, or parts of Africa. In any case, we got on this train.
Manny, if I could, before we go on to talk about getting on the train, we have a question from a student, a video question named Cecilia. She's asking about betrayal from non-Jewish neighbors. Let's go ahead and listen to Cecilia's question, if we might.
My name is Cecilia, and I am from Washington, D.C. I was wondering whether any of these individuals who would choose to comply with this poor treatment towards you and other Jews were ever neighbors or people you had any kinds of relationships with prior to the Holocaust in Budapest?
Manny, Cecilia's question is, were any of these individuals who chose to comply with the poor treatment of you and other Jews ever neighbors or people you had any kind of relationship with?
A relationship, probably not, but I did know who they were. And I'll give you an example of this if you wish. Yes?
Please, yeah.
We had 4 spaces on this train. My mother and I, my uncle, and a cousin of mine, one of my father's brother's children, who did not live in Budapest, lived in Vukovar, which is in Yugoslavia. A kid my age or a little younger, I don't remember. He came up to Budapest to be with us to get ready for the train. The superintendent of our building was not a closet Nazi, but a Nazi. We were very concerned that if this guy sees the kid who does not speak Hungarian, he'll know he's not from here and he'll turn him in. So he asked us about people that we knew that were Nazi sympathizers without being in any kind of official jobs. Absolutely. An example, the superintendent of the building. I mean, I knew him, and I knew who he was. His name was Finta, Mr. Finta. I remember that. As it happens, because of the situation, we decided to ship the boy back to his home because we figured that he'd come up to Budapest on half a day's notice. We can, by train. Unfortunately, while he was shipped back to his house, his mother and his father and I were all deported. So he did not join our group.
Manny, and why was your father not part of your group?
Because he was in a labor camp.
Okay.
Lots, about an hour from Budapest. No way, Jose, for him to leave. I mean, you couldn't walk out of camps with armed guards. Mm-hmm. Besides the fact that if he had done that, or if anybody did that, or tried to do it, they would come up with a response called decimation. You know what decimation is?
I do, yeah.
You line people up and every 10th man gets shot. That's decimation.
So the so-called Kastner train left Hungary with you and your mother and your uncle on June 30th, 1944. What do you recall of the actual journey itself, the train ride?
It was a 9-day train ride. It was summertime. We were locked in a train during the day with maybe 45 to 50 people. You could stand, you could squat, you couldn't lie down. There were 2 buckets, one with fresh water, I think, and one with not fresh water. At night, they'd open the gates, the doors, and we could sleep outside under blankets. It was nice. They had field kitchens bring us some food. We were told to pack some food with us, and everybody had some. So food was not a problem. It was not pleasant, but it was durable. This was a 9-day trip. Excuse me.
Mm-hmm.
That's better. This was a 9-day trip. And we arrived at a place which nobody had ever heard of nor seen. But the sign by the railroad station said, Bergen-Belsen. Bergen-Belsen is between 2 German villages near Hanover called Bergen and Belsen. It had been a military camp by the German government and a training ground, next to which, about 2 miles away, they built barracks to become a concentration camp. Now, you need to know Bergen-Belsen was not a killing camp. It was a camp where later on people died of starvation, malnutrition, and typhus, but it was not a place with crematoria. We were marched to this place, and we were told we're here for 3 days of R&R, rest and recuperation, before our boat trip. The boat trip didn't happen.
And in fact, Manny, that was your expectation. You were supposed to leave Europe, go to a neutral place, and here you end up at this camp, Bergen-Belsen, where you would actually end up staying a total of, I think, 6 months. What can you tell us about your life in Bergen-Belsen, what that was like for you personally?
Well, a concentration camp, by definition, is a place where you don't want to be and where you're not going to get, rich treatment. But obviously, we all survived. Now, one of the advantages of our group was that because we were this hostage group, for which there is, as I said before, 35 cars, 1,700 people, but the reward to the Germans was enormous amounts of valuables in suitcases, gold and silver and diamonds, stuff that's negotiable any time in the world for some people at some time. They were not going to get a dime of that until we were all released. So they made sure that although we didn't have pleasant living conditions under any circumstance, at least we were not shot every day. We were also not turned out to work every day, which was a major debilitating issue to people, which killed many. We saw people marching out to work in the fields every day and marching back home. We didn't have to do that. The two major activities of the day for everybody was one, again, the census. We had to be out at dawn and wait until we were counted. Why, I can't tell you. Armed guards in towers and fences, which may have been electrified, prevented anybody from leaving or escaping or trying to escape. Until a lieutenant came and said, this is absurd. He had some sense in his brain. I don't care what time you get here in the morning, I will be at 8 sharp. Be here at 8. 15 minutes before it is 5. It was a major point. He said at 4 in the morning, it was 7:45, which probably saved many lives. The second issue had to do with food. And the food issues had to do with the food that they provided, plus the food that we brought with us. Now, we didn't bring a great deal, but everybody brought some stuff. I remember that my mother was able to find, and others did too, a company in town which was able to reseal tin cans. So like a can of peas, once you ate the peas, you were able to wash it out, refill it with warm stuff, and then reseal it, and that would protect it from botulism or other kind of disease. We had that. My mother also brought with her a liter of chicken fat. Very good because it's nutritious. She brought with her a liter of honey. And she brought with her, this was very, very strange, a large, I don't know how many kilo of bacon. I come from an observant, kosher Jewish family. Bacon was never in my eyesight, let alone my mouth. But under these conditions, people determined, hey, you do what you can and what you have to survive. A piece of the bacon, some of the honey, and some of the chicken fat was still available the last day we left Bergen-Belsen. It was taken out, I think, with pincers and with eyedroppers, and used with such little amount that it lasted for 6 months. The food that we got from them was very minimal, mostly inedible, but it was at least hot, and it was to some degree nourishing.
Manny, I was struck by something you shared with me. You said that despite the austerity and the difficulties and the cruelty in the camp, the inmates, your fellow Jews, tried to establish some sense of normalcy there. Will you say a little bit about that?
Bill, the will to survive is incredibly strong, and the more it's threatened, the stronger it becomes. I mentioned a little while ago that my mother had these tin cans, but once they were, in fact, emptied, she could trade them for whatever, and then some people would make jewelry out of them. Armbands, earrings, rings. They would trade the jewelry for 2 cigarettes, which could then be traded for a haircut, and then it was traded for a pair of shoes, and that was traded for something else. The point I'm making is that people who had been in business, many of them, before this event of the Holocaust, were attempting to in some way establish themselves in business, as it were, best they could, because it was something that in some way lifted their will and their power to survive. I hope that tells you something about it.
It does. Thank you for saying that. In December 1944, after 6 months at Bergen-Belsen, you and the majority of the group that you arrived with at Bergen-Belsen were then sent to Switzerland, which was neutral during the war. Tell us about getting to Switzerland and what happened once you arrived there.
After 6 weeks in Bergen-Belsen, well, first let me say the discussions between Eichmann and his minions And Kastner continued. Kastner's family was in the camp with us. He was not. These continued, and about 1,300, about a quarter of the group, was released after 6 weeks and taken to Switzerland. I have no idea what became of them, although there are a couple of them that I knew after the war. We stayed for 6 months, at which point we too, as part of these negotiations and the desire of the Nazis to receive the loot, we were taken to Switzerland, this time not by cattle cars, but by German troop trains. The trains were not first class, but there were seats in them. And that's how we got to Switzerland. And I will never forget the sight of having arrived at the Swiss border. The Swiss were very clever. The Swiss railroad gauge is different than the German railroad gauge. You can't drive a German train into Switzerland, which means you can't invade by train. Clever people, the Swiss. We arrived on one side of the platform in these somewhat rickety, dark, and not first-class trains. And on the other side of the platform were these warm, lit, beautiful Swiss trains on which they serve as chocolate and hot chocolate. And that's where we got into to go from that particular spot to where we're going to be for the next several weeks, which was near the city of Montreux in the French part of Switzerland, in a community called Caux, which had been a major, major vacation spot taken over by the Red Cross. And we were fed a lot of potatoes because all of us were not necessarily skeletons, but we could all use a few pounds.
Manny, before we go on about your time in Switzerland, I want to share a question from one of our audience members, Kelly. Kelly wrote, "You were a little boy during these terrible times. How did you and your family deal with fear?"
Well, I think in two ways. I think the adults were afraid. We kids weren't, because you have to learn what fear is. And if you don't know what it is, you're not afraid of it. And I must say to you that actually very few incidents happened in the camp which produced fear. I mean, when the question was asked, why is there a man on top of a tower with what looks like a gun? We were told, well, that's to make sure that nobody bothers us. And we don't leave. Not escape, leave. Why there were fences? To keep us from the other prisoners who were from Poland. We're not supposed to intermingle with them. There were explanations given to kids which essentially ensured that their fear level is not really touched, because there's nothing to, quote, be afraid of. The word Nazi didn't mean anything. Bergen-Belsen didn't mean anything. Auschwitz and killing camps and crematoria didn't mean anything. So why be afraid?
Manny, once you were in Switzerland, at some point, you and your mother were then sent to a children's home, which was in Switzerland. Tell us about this children's home and why your mother went with you.
We were in this resort hotel in the French part, and we had to vacate that hotel eventually once we got a few pounds on us, because the next group had to come in, whoever they were. 20 Hungarian kids ages 6 to 15. The 6-year-old is on my shoulders in the picture, who is a non-blood related cousin. He and a bunch of other kids, boys and girls up to the age of 14, were sent to this children's, it's like a residential school in the outskirts of St. Gallen, the German part of Switzerland. Now, none of us spoke any language except Hungarian. This camp was run by the Swiss and German and French-speaking people. You see the picture, the gentleman, the second from the left in the back row, bald head, Mr. Müller, Paul Müller, was a Swiss educator. The nurse, who's holding the 6-year-old kid, was also Swiss. My mother's in the back in the middle. But the point, they all spoke French and German. How would we even say hello to them for a while? So they had to send somebody along to be warden, guard, teacher, educator, and everything else under the sun. My mother had very good German from school days, and she had a good amount of French, not as good as German, but a good amount. She could communicate. She was hired as part of the staff, and she was a guardian, a whatever you want to call her title, I don't know, and took care of us, 20 kids. I don't know how many kids are in the picture, but I think there were 20 of us in the group. There may be somebody missing. I know two of the kids in the group. I cannot recognize them, but there were two kids, one of whom is still alive, lives in Israel. He's a retired professor. The other was in the second row. I am on the left. You can see me circled. The kid at the end of the next row, with his hands at his side, was a kid I remember from Budapest. What happened to him, I don't know, until he came to this country and became apparently a world-renowned rice scientist at Michigan State University in Lansing, Michigan. I knew he was, had some contact with him. Unfortunately, he passed away. Yeah. So life there was kind of a private school life. We had food, we had teaching, we had lessons, we had swimming, we had all kinds of things. It was very pleasant.
And you had your mother with you, which is...
My mother with me had both an advantage and a disadvantage. When you're the teacher's kid,
good point.
It gives you some certain advantages, people think, but you also get blamed for everything that happens. One kid walked off the campus because his parents came to visit and he didn't have permission, didn't get permission. That night I got my share of being angry with because they said I ratted on a kid. I didn't. But being the teacher's kid, you get both the best and the worst.
Makes sense.
Very survivable.
Yeah. Manny, World War II officially ended in Europe on May 8th, 1945. That happened to be the day of your 9th birthday. You and your mother relocated to British-controlled Palestine, and you were later reunited with your father. Please tell us about the reunion and what it was like to adjust to having your life back together with both your parents.
Well, May the 8th, 1945, as you said, was my birthday. It is also has two other very important reasons for existing. Namely, it was the end of the war in Europe, so-called VE Day was May the 8th, 1945. It is also the birthday of the President of the United States at the time. Those of us who know some history know that Roosevelt dies on April 12th. The president then within 20 minutes is Harry Truman. Harry Truman was born May the 8th, 18-something. So Harry, the war, and I share a birthday, for which I'm very pleased and very proud. Mm-hmm. We were living in Israel by this time. My father came out in 1946, having been able to travel from Hungary, much by foot with some other people, arrived, and then we had to kind of meet each other. For 2 years specifically, and then for 4 years in a slightly different way, I hardly knew him. So at the ages of 7 to 10 or so, I didn't know very much of him. We spoke different languages. I had a different name. We had to get acquainted and to learn to know each other, and we did. And from August 1946 until he died, almost the age of 90 in 1994, he and I and my mother, who died earlier, unfortunately very young, unrelated to the war, we were a family of 3.
Manny, we're getting to the end, but I have another question from one of our viewers. And Andy asks, how long after the war could you speak openly about your experience?
I could speak about my experience openly from the day after the war. The question is where. It was not discussed. I mean, with my mother and my father and family and relatives all over the place, to some degree with some friends. But it was not a point of discussion in open forum at any point, not until the 80s. In 1980 or 81, there were 2 major conferences called, one in Jerusalem and one in Washington. It gave the rise to the organization of survivor groups and survivor organizations and societies, and that's when discussion about the Holocaust began to take place. Why it didn't for many years before is another long story. As far as I'm concerned, I did not begin to talk about it with any frequency until well after 1980, when I was a full-grown adult. Mm-hmm. I spoke about it with other people, to some degree with some of my very closest friends. The fact that I was a survivor, what it meant, I didn't discuss. It just was not discussed. I did not come from a family where, shh, can't say it. We talked about it. The question is where.
Before I go to my final question for you, just one more comment from an audience member. Josephine writes, thank you, Bill. I'll take that. And then she says, and bless you, Manny, for sharing your family history. That is from Josephine. Manny, I have just one more question for you today, and that is, as we face a dangerous surge in anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial, please tell us why you feel it is important to share your firsthand account of the Holocaust and what all of us can learn from it.
I speak as I do for a number of reasons. One, because I have the experience and I had to live through it. The question of man's treatment of man is something that people should know about, what man is capable of doing. It is something that people don't know unless somebody tells them, because it's hard to believe. Secondly, I speak this way because I think that I am part of an educational system. I believe that much of what happens in the world, from anti-Semitism to anything else, has to do with being uneducated. Whether we're stupid, dumb, or idiotic is not the issue. People just are not educated. They don't know. There was this professor in California in 1920s who made a comment with which I am very familiar, and although I don't necessarily follow all of his teachings, I do believe this line. He said, "Those of us who do not learn history may be doomed to repeat it," whatever that is. George Santayana was a man's name, was an Italian professor, and I think that we have a problem. We do not know history. If you take a look at today's newspaper 10, 20, 40, 60 years ago, we basically do not know history. And since we don't, we operate in all kinds of prejudgments and precursors, and as a consequence, we treat each other as we do. In order to try to do whatever I can to eliminate that, I do what I do.
And Manny, I've had the privilege and the pleasure of listening to you tell your story on several occasions, and I know you've done that in many, many forums and schools and institutions, government facilities. And I know I speak for everybody who's viewing today, our enormous gratitude to you for being willing to continue to share what you experienced, what your family experienced, and the fact that you also bring into not only just what happened to you, but a good sense, a good perspective of history and what was going on in the world at that time. So just a huge thank you for being willing to take this time for all of us. Thank you.
By all means. Obviously, if you know that I was 9 and 45, you can calculate my age. Having come to this age, I have done what I have, and I will plan to do it as long as I possibly can. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Manny, so much. I'd like to just take a moment to say thank you to our donor. First Person is made possible through the generous support of the Lewis Franklin Smith Foundation. And I would also like to invite all of you to join us again for our next First Person program in August. So hopefully you can tune in and join us in August again. Thank you all for being with us today, and just a big thank you to Manny Mandel.